Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you for the welcome at Perpignan. It seems a very, very warm place. All the colleagues have been extremely helpful to all of us, I think, and friendly, and especially thanks to Benedict, who I think is the driving force behind all this, but she's had a lot of support too. Although they're not usually concerned with recent history, geologists have lately begun to suspect that we have seen the end of the beneficent era of the Holocene, whose temperate climate conditions helped humans develop many of the skills and institutions that define our species. With the Industrial Revolution, the intensive consumption of fossil fuels began, and mechanized agriculture, among other things, permitted the human population to grow exponentially. This ushered in the Anthropocene, a new epoch in which the actions of humans altered the course of Earth's deep history. Our impact on the planet is now measurable in the air, on the land, and on the ocean. So we can no longer sustain the belief that man is distinct from nature. Bruno Latour has argued that by thinking ourselves separate from the milieu in which we live, and I'm especially thinking of Western people here, we moderns claimed control over everything we classify as non-human. By dividing the world into thinking beings, res cogitans, and material objects, res extensa, we gained power. But we reimagined our environment in ways that robbed it of its magic. Enchant is from the Latin incantare, to pronounce spells. With the Industrial Revolution, poets took up the task of reenchanting the world, celebrating spaces unsullied by human activity. However, aestheticizing nature only perpetuates the compartmentalization that indirectly brought on the rapid planetary changes we are now experiencing. So, is reenchantment really needed in the brave new world of the Anthropocene? Should writers continue to celebrate a wildness that is conceptualized as humanity's other? Should readers console themselves by contemplating a green world if it no longer exists? I will argue that writers need forms of address to help readers understand the ways in which the Anthropocene upsets our habitual understanding of time and space. In Eco-Criticism on the Edge, Timothy Clark provocatively questions whether writing is a mode that can address contemporary ecological issues at all, since language is bound to vehicle a human point of view. Despite the ways in which human lives are inextricably bound up in a complex meshwork of things, that's Ingold, what we think of as the other than human, what Descartes called res extensa, generally plays a decisively minor role in literature. An ecological event like climate change takes place on a much larger scale than the personal and social realms that have traditionally been the focus of literary works. Thus, Clark reads a number of texts for what is not spoken about, pointing to silences and omissions in a critical move similar to the one Toni Morrison employs in Playing in the Dark, where she reflects on the meaningful absences of African Americans in canonical works of American literature. Somehow, we have to overcome the evident disconnection between our growing knowledge of the complex systems shaping our existence and the aesthetic modes available to imagine them. Since inventing new forms of discourse is one of the ways we adapt to changing circumstances, our culture perhaps needs to move beyond the inherited terms and perceptions. In this paper, I will discuss a selection of books written just before or after the turn of the millennium that focus on American places. The writers I will talk about have begun to produce imaginative and creative accounts of the ways that human activities have altered the Earth's ecological balance. They focus on places that humans have transformed by nuclear energy development, Malloy and Solnit, by waste disposal, Sullivan, or by carbon emissions, Mutel. Their works are transitional, positioned at the threshold at which the writers bid farewell to nature to usher in the Anthropocene. They are part of a tradition begun by Thoreau when he built a cabin at Walden Pond as a site from which to critique the growing materialism of the newly industrialized American nation. He was writing at the moment at which many scientists would locate the beginning of the Anthropocene era. The problems he saw were minor compared to those that we now face, and so our conceptualization of our milieu has had to change in response. Lauren Isley saw his contemporaries as the world eaters. E.O. Wilson sees us as planetary killers. But both writers are aware that if humanity has set its planetary home on fire, it has not provided an escape. Like all other Earth dwellers, our species depends on the life-sustaining conditions that the planet provides. Rather than succumbing to panic, most of us find ways to avoid considering the prospect of our own extinction. I'm not simply referring to climate skeptics or the politicians who put growth before sustainability. Most of us balance conscientious efforts to improve the situation with comfortable but destructive habits. It's not that we are not looking for solutions. In reply to my question about how to save the planet, Google pulled up over 76 million websites. The actions listed to help reduce greenhouse gases generally required only minor adjustments to the typical affluent person's lifestyle, like using wax paper instead of plastic to wrap food, or turning off the lights when you're not in the room. Practicing some of these little things that we can all do in the Anthropocene era to save the planet allows us to indulge in a mild form of denial, as if it were not the continuation of our own species that is threatened, at least in its current modes, rather than the planet. Perhaps in continuing to seek consolation in nature, and nature is often in scare quotes, we're like the people who are facing the end of their lives in the 1973 film Soylent Green, who are soothing their exit from the damaged world of the Anthropocene era with images of the gone but not forgotten green world. That longing for a phantasmal, pristine world of nature probably dates back to Genesis. Europeans thought they had rediscovered it on arriving in America. Some of their descendants tried to sustain the illusion in embracing the idea of wilderness and binding it to ideas of American exceptionalism. In the 20th century, such men would go to the mountains to find themselves, as John Muir so memorably remarks in a much-quoted journal entry. Not like taking the veil, no solemn abjuration of the world. I only went out for a walk, and finally concluded to stay out till sundown, for going out, I found, was going in. The paradoxical conflation of outside and inside collapses the Cartesian opposition between res cogitans and res extensa, but it does so by having the subject completely engulf the world. To create his world-embracing substitute for the anchorite cell, Muir has to imagine the landscape emptied of all signs of humanity. This is one way of avoiding the messiness of humans' insertion in the environment. It's also a way for the descendant of settlers to efface all prior claims to the land. In Savage Dreams, Rebecca Solnit quotes the journal entry Muir made after he camped on the shore of Lake Tenaya, a lake ironically named after the ousted Indian chief, in what is now Yosemite National Park. The lake with its rocky bays and promontories well defined, its depth pictured with the reflected mountains, its surface just sufficiently tremulous to make the mirrored stars swarm like water lilies in a woodland pond. This is my old haunt where I began my studies. I camped on this very spot. No foot seems to have neared it. One cannot help feeling enchanted by Muir's shimmering image of the mirrored stars that he transmutes into flowers in a poetic rendering of the lake's optical inversion of the sky. And I admit I relish reading Muir because he so ably compensates for the sense of isolation that comes from my modern renunciation of faith in God and my ingrained conception of my milieu as something outside myself. With the incantatory magic of his words, he reconnects us with the environment. Solnit's book undoes the spell that Muir weaves in his description of Lake Tenaya by pointing out what the writer does not see there. She reminds readers that Yosemite is a homeland shaped in the interactions of its dwellers, animal, vegetable, and mineral, and not least of all by the Indians that the Mariposa Battalion had tried to exterminate in order to open up the land to the extractive economic activities that lured white settlers to California. Instead of using language to re-enchant our relation to the land, Solnit, along with other more or less contemporary writers of place, tries to redefine that relation by showing the complexity of history. In place of the timeless nature contemplated by earlier writers, the new literature of place features enmeshed space-times evolving in the interactions of human and non-human agents. It does not relinquish the attempt to make emotional connections with the environment, but it tries to care about place without sacrificing a sense of its mixedness. Some of the writers start from the dream of renewal in a return to a green world, but then they move on to the recognition that humans have always co-created and co-defined the places where they find themselves. Neither peoples nor places are stable and unchanging. In the mesh of connections and interactions, what we have done and what we do have consequences that are too complex to be predicted, let alone controlled. We live in what Latour, borrowing the latter term from William James, has called an entangled pluriverse. Traditionally, as Scott Slovic has shown in his study of writers from Thoreau to Barry Lopez, nature writing explores the individual consciousness in the process of perceiving the natural world. The writers go out, like John Muir, to find that they are going in. The environment of the Anthropocene disrupts this harmonious relationship, and writers have to account for a new sense of a misfit between outside and inside. Ellen Malloy relates this experience in The Last Cheater's Waltz, a book in which she recounts her exploration of the territory surrounding the house she is building in the Utah desert. The waltz of the title describes the desert dweller's habitual embrace of her surroundings in a love dance with a place whose incandescent beauty, coupled with her capacity to respond, is her means of gaining a thrilling affirmation of her own existence. She claims to have, I quote, a local, if not a regional reputation for sensory intensity. Surprisingly, though, the book begins with a domestic accident that changes her relation to her milieu. One morning, in a rough-hewn, single-room screen house in a cottonwood grove, but a few wing beats beyond the San Juan River, I poured scalding water through a paper coffee filter into a mug that, unbeknownst to me, contained a lizard still dormant from the cool night. I boiled the lizard alive. I sat on the front step of the screenhouse with sunrise burning crimson on the sandstone cliffs above the river and a boiled reptile in my cup. I knew then that matters of the mind had plunged to grave depths. I was either hopelessly unmoored from myself or hopelessly lost in the murk of self. The problem, obviously, was that I could no longer make the distinction between the two. The sunrise, desert, and dormant lizard are just a few elements in the web of connections that includes the caffeine-loving desert dweller. The scene features a key insight of the Anthropocene that the speaker has been ill-prepared to acknowledge the unintended consequences of the interaction she engages in. Her fatal encounter with a co-inhabitant of the desert prompts her realization of her confusion about both her surroundings and herself. The distinctions between inside and outside have collapsed. She is either unmoored from self or hopelessly lost in self. The writer strains a metaphor to breaking point to capture her disarray at this traumatic discovery of her entanglement with other things. She becomes a footless nomad, it doesn't come up, sorry, some of the PowerPoint didn't work. Footless nomad caught in a slipstream of indifference. This breakdown is the first stage toward gaining awareness of the state of things in the Anthropocene. In order to take their distance from the traditional modes of relating to their milieu, the new American writers of place mobilized the stylistic resources of literature to challenge entrenched ideas. Parody is one of the modes available. Malloy caricatures a scenario in which the subject merges with her surroundings in psychic fusion. This is the point of her pages on the quest for the claret cup cactus flower. Seeking fundamental union with primordial nature, she drives 70 miles to find enough of those gorgeous grenadine blooms to drive me mad with love. For, she explains, a mound of claret cups in full bloom throws its glory against the russet desert in brazen harlotry. The sensuous hyperbole of her description turns parodic when she imagines she becomes a very small bug hovering over a blood-red cup and little bug heart pounding dove in. This parody of the search for immersion in the natural world prepares for her discovery of the way the desert landscape has been modified by its induction into the nuclear age. In a book that recounts an exploration of the swampland that overlooks the skyscrapers of Manhattan, the Meadowlands Wilderness Adventures at the Edge of a City, Robert Sullivan evokes traditional modes of place writing in order to draw attention to the novelty of his own account. The Walden Swamp chapter of the book makes these connections explicit, while drawing attention to the comic disparity between Sullivan's latter-day adventure and its most famous precedent. Like Thoreau, Sullivan explores a place that is near at hand, on the edge of more fully settled territory. I began to consider taking a trip to Walden Swamp and then spending some time out there and maybe even contemplating nature and civilization, just like Thoreau or someone like that. He is determined to commune with nature and what have you. Walden Swamp is actually in the Meadowlands. The familiar language has a distancing and debunking effect that smacks of burlesque. Similarly, the itemized list of the equipment the adventurer purchases to explore this swamp in the northwestern corner of the Meadowlands imitates both the memorandum of articles in readiness for the voyage that Lewis and Clark appears in the Lewis and Clark expedition, and Thoreau's list of expenses in the economy chapter of Walden, except that the snappy brand names of these items and their inflated prices show the extent to which consumerism has triumphed in Sullivan's America. These texts humorously illustrate how much the engagement with a milieu is shaped by already produced scripts. Even though I'm British by birth, when traveling in America, I imagine myself finding adventure in unexplored wilderness, or finding harmony by escaping to a space of pristine natural beauty. The canonical texts of American place writing mediate my experience of the land and help me sustain the fantasy that there are places outside the thoroughly humanized space-time of the Anthropocene. The new place writing bids farewell to those earlier modes of interaction by ironically measuring their distances from contemporary explorations of place. One of the first things that these writers have to do is to adjust their range of vision. Emerson's transparent eyeball is not adequate to the task of mediating the landscapes of the Anthropocene. These writers take a longer view, exploring what is beyond the horizon and consulting scientific studies that stretch the limits of sensory perception. They have to look with what Ellen Malloy calls the unnaturalist's eye. When she extends her vision beyond her cactus flowers and beyond the intricate network of dry washes that fanned out like dendritic veins, Malloy discovers the thing that will trigger a new quest. Cutting across the wash, cutting across the wash was an unlikely sight, the world's longest, curviest landing strip. The metaphors war with each other here. The landing strip, its oddity accentuated by the superlatives, disrupts the more familiar dendritic veins of the arroyos with the violence of a knife cutting into a body. The strip cutting through her beloved desert landscape turns out to be a road as elegantly broad as a Parisian boulevard. It leads her on a journey to knowledge of the atomic history of the Great Basin. In a similar adjustment of vision, Sullivan learns that a body of water that looks natural in Walden Swamp was in fact formed by the construction of railroad lines and new and old turnpikes. And the green hills that he sees there are grass-covered garbage dumps. Arriving at her campsite in the Nevada desert, Solnit has to remind herself to be afraid of the dust because its potential danger is invisible. To see mortality in the dust by imagining it in the unstable isotopes of radioactive decay took an act of educated faith. To get a wider view of global warming from her home in Iowa City, Cornelia Mutel has to pore over the curves on a graph charting global average surface temperatures actual and predicted from 1900 to 2100, as well as to study what such dramatic temperature increases would mean. In order to come to terms with the Anthropocene's paradoxical geography of consequence, these writers have to broaden the span of space-time that the American literature of place usually considers. It's no longer possible to remain focused on the moment as if places had no past or no future, nor is it possible to think of a locality as contained within definable boundaries. The toxic waste that made mercury the key landscape ingredient in Walden Swamp was dumped there between 1929 and 1974. Unsurprisingly, a 2015 Fish and Wildlife Service report shows that the water is still heavily contaminated, in spite of the fact that the Environmental Protection Agency designated adjacent industrial sites as Superfund cleanup spots in the 1980s. Further west, the atomic testing in the Four Corners region produced radioactive waste whose danger to the environment will stretch over millennia. Malloy mentions one nuclear burial site in New Mexico that bears the epitaph, "This site shall remain dangerous for 24,000 years." Solnit learns that the US Department of Energy, the DOE, makes a slightly less conservative estimate of the danger of nuclear waste, only 10,000 years. When she asks geologist Steve Frischmann about the reasoning behind that figure. He explains that if you're going to do a probabilistic risk analysis and you're looking out to some distance in the future, when you get to about 10 to the fourth, meaning about 10,000 years, you start vastly increasing uncertainty. In fact, Solnit goes on to explain that the DOE expects that in 10,000 years our language and culture will be extinct, since none has ever lasted a fraction of that time. Marking the waste deposit sites in such a way that the warnings will last 10 millennia and still be meaningful to whomever may come along has been something of a challenge to the DOE's futurists. Clearly, the time spans involved in man-made disturbances of the environment surpass our normal imaginative faculties. Another challenge brought to us in the Anthropocene is that of projecting how the consequences of our greenhouse gas emissions will play out in time. Scientists make graphs to project into the future, but they are too abstract for the general public. Besides, industrial lobbyists have seized on the professional caution written into scientific hypotheses to discount their projections. At the other extreme, the science fiction writers' apocalyptic visions of future destruction may seem too fantastic to modify our sense of the real. What about the literature of place? Environmental writer Cornelia Mutel wrote a Sugar Creek Chronicle in order to heighten awareness of the extent and reach of the dangers involved in climate change. Her book employs a twofold personal chronology. First, imitating Thoreau's Walden, she presents an account of her year in her woodland home from January to December 2012. She describes the cycle of seasonal changes, noting the ways in which the year deviates from earlier climatic norms and making projections as to how this might upset the ecosystem of the oak forest in which she lives. Nevertheless, the scale of climate change is so vast that the view of a single observer would be hopelessly inadequate. So her chronicle of the year includes details from various news sources about weather-related anomalies taking place in a much wider geographical radius. Then, alongside these journal entries, she interleaves a second timeline that covers some of the events of her life from childhood onward. She documents the time of her ignorance, drawing readers in with a rhetorical question and admitting to her own insouciance during the 1970s. Why dwell on potential problems before being forced to do so? Our days were full and good. I assumed that humanity could never irreversibly alter two of Earth's largest entities, the globe's atmosphere and its oceans, nor could we ever destabilize something as huge and complex as our planet's climate system. The recourse to this double persona, her earlier self contrasting with her present self, produces dramatic irony and engages readers' complicity and comprehension. To address the problem of scale that climate change poses, a Sugar Creek Chronicle retracts the temporal time span of the Anthropocene to human dimensions. The book's double time span allows the writer to make an analogy between the unsuspected dangers of climate change and the unforeseen development of cancer in her mother's body and her own. Both can distort healthy functions and ultimately lead to dramatic changes, and both are best treated by strong actions taken early before they spin toward points of no return. By putting a personal problem in parallel with a planetary one, Mutel shrinks the vast global warming phenomenon down to a humanly imaginable size. As a child, she assumed that regardless of what we did, human life and my family would go on forever. It could not change in its most fundamental manner. Nevertheless, things did change. Her mother's cancer was diagnosed too late, when it was past what she calls the tipping point. and at age 18, the writer lost the safe refuge of her family home. She offers her life experience as a parable about the urgency of taking action in the face of global warming. Radiation, pollution, global warming, these are rather dismal subjects to evoke in creative nonfiction about place. They discourage joyous celebrations of individual renewal in contact with nature's eternal beauty. Nonetheless, all of the writers I am considering here express passionate commitment to the places they write about, and their texts engage readers too, but in ways that differ from earlier place writing. One of the ways they do this is by opening the text to multiple voices and opinions, deviating from the sometimes monologic tendencies of nature writing. On their quest for a fuller representation of place, they weave into their texts extracts from maps, books, and reports. In addition, they question other people and relay their experiences and opinions. Place emerges as contested, traversed by competing interests, even as it compels attachment. Ellen Malloy interviews the director of the Los Alamos facility, who admits not considering anything as far-reaching as the future of mankind when he was the leader of the bomb assembly team. "We were at war and the damn thing worked," he says. She talks to a neighbor who used to be a trucker hauling uranium ore from mines, who thinks that the end of the Cold War was a tragedy. Solnit speaks to the victims of fallout and retells their stories. But she also tours Ground Zero with a DOE public relations representative to get the official account of affairs at the Nevada test site. She makes a difference between the two kinds of discourse. The former, the victims, she calls a strong foundation of stories. The latter, a tissue of tourism. By mentioning both, she furthers readers' understanding of how Americans could have rendered part of their territory unfit for human habitation. The meadow swampland that Sullivan explores is fringed with towns and crisscrossed with roads. To investigate, he enters into contact with diverse humans with surprising attitudes and experiences, like the mayor of Secaucus, who boasts of how he polishes the town's dubious reputation for pig farming by reframing it as recycling. Or the owner of a garbage dump who tours his property like an adventurer, alert to fresh discoveries. Or the mosquito inspector who counts the number of mosquitoes that land on him and brags to have the all-time record for numbers. Sullivan relays these meadowlands' voices with gusto, capturing their different sociolects and idiolects and their particular modes of relating to their surroundings. Through their voices, the despised swamp takes on character and interest. It is part of people's lives, even as it resiliently repels their schemes to tame it and to make it serve human designs. The voices that Cornelia Mutel quotes in a Sugar Creek Chronicle are those of her family members, her neighbors, or the radio reporters who relay news of the exceptional weather events of 2012, the drought in Iowa, the fires in the West, Hurricane Sandy in New York, or Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. But she also receives messages from non-human sources. Things speak to her. Fossils tell her about the past. The orderly seasonal comings and goings of plants and animals speak of the maintenance of life, while the fissures in the earth and the shriveling of plants protest the lack of water during the drought. To bring home to readers the lively agency of more than human things, these texts embrace an aesthetic of mixedness. For Mutel, initially, the interactivity of things seems miraculous. For example, the nutrients circle around the globe as well as within my body. The silent, magical decomposition executed by trillions of bacteria and fungi allows life to prevail. Somehow all life depends on energy pouring down from the sun. Rain falling on my face ends up in the oceans, from there rising again to the skies. All this complexity is both gift and responsibility. This sense of wonder remains as Mutel grows older and learns more about ecology, but she becomes aware of another dynamic taking hold. And so, even as I was studying nature's integrity, I began discovering how out-of-control growth of many types was spreading throughout the landscape. As the US population and per-person consumption grew, fossil fuel use soared exponentially, resources were depleted, native plants and animals dropped in number, and toxic waste multiplied. Local problems inflated into regional dilemmas, and regional problems spread around the globe. The idyllic daily life in the Colorado mountains that fostered in the writer's younger self a sense of ecological harmony contrasts with her more mature understanding of the environmental damage wreaked by American prosperity. She becomes aware that the things humans exploit have their own weird chemistry that works to make the environment less and less hospitable to us, the opposite effect to the one intended. The language of place writing has to expand to take in these unwanted and unexpected interactions. While Mutel's exposition of environmental contradictions is straight and serious, Solnit chooses irony to describe the strangeness of American places in the Anthropocene. For example, she tells of passing the town of Rhyolite in Nevada and seeing a pretty gleam of silver in the distance, rather than the picturesque mountain lake of conventional place writing. It is the largest cyanide pond in the world, with next to it a mountain being digested into tailings for gold. In the extractive industrial West that seldom features in literature, what seems pretty from a distance can be deadly, and what seems eternal can be digested. In Malloy's and Sullivan's books, we find an absurdist humor of contraries that makes the anomalies of the Anthropocene as fascinating as they are disturbing. In Malloy's desert landscape, the descriptive categories normally defining animal, vegetable, and mineral become mixed or inverted. Roles reverse when the spadefoot toads, vaporized by the atomic blast at the Trinity test site, writ themselves into history. While the scientists spawned the primary death anxiety of the rest of all time. Metaphor creates new hybrids to describe the achievement of the scientists who turned uranium into plutonium, an element that feels warm like a live rabbit. In a dizzying collapse of boundaries, animals write history, males give birth, and inorganic things come alive. In Sullivan's Meadowlands, the cars follow migratory patterns. A driver encounters a herd of trucks, and fish have scales on their backs that were gross and coarse in the pattern of worn-out radial tires. This mixing of categories recognizes that the natural and the man-made are not separate. They come together in new ways in the Anthropocene era. Instead of filtering out what is not human in order to sustain illusions about the separation of the natural and the social, these writers confront us with the bizarre hybridity of the contemporary world. This new aesthetic of incongruity emphasizes the fact that we can no longer expect orderly, predictable forms and cycles. The unexpected becomes the new ecological pattern. Places are not stable. Their evolution is unpredictable. This realization might induce a sense of the futility of action, but that is not what these books advocate. In different ways, their investigations of place open onto the future. Malloy has to come to terms with the fact that her beloved desert is not pristine. Rather than a reason for despair, she takes this as a call to responsibility. I look into my coffee cup before I pour, and I try to live here as if there is no other place and it must last forever. It is the best we can do. Everyone's home is the heartland of consequence. Solnit finishes her book with a description of a counter-quincentennial Columbus Day celebration at which the anti-nuclear protesters, descendants of both indigenous and settler peoples, joined together in a circle dance to celebrate their earthly home and their shared desire to defend it. Mutel ends with a list of positive actions that readers can take to work toward planetary recovery. Sullivan ends with an apostrophe to the swamp. Oh, Meadowlands, how is it that you will somehow manage to be spoiled but unspoiled, trod upon and bulldozed, remediated and reclaimed, dumped in and sprayed all over, but somehow never spent? Past efforts to exploit the swampland have ended in failure. Schemes have gone awry, transforming the land in unintended ways. The Meadowlands remains vulnerable but resistant to new endeavors to extract profit from it. It is humanity's place on Earth that is called into question. The texts that I've considered here bid farewell to the belief that nature is separate from human beings, whether as something to be enjoyed or exploited. They also revise the old idea that places are separate from one another, showing the error of celebrating the transcendent beauty of spaces unspoiled by human interference. They advocate reconnection more than reenchantment. To address the dissolution of boundaries in the Anthropocene era, they employ hybrid figures that acknowledge the unpredictable interactions among things. At the sites they depict, competing interests converge and sometimes clash, so the text's polyvocality suggests the variety of intentions that have to be negotiated and debated among Earth's many co-dwellers. Just as humans raise their voices in debate, things also have their say one way or another. The new Litter of Place improvises a forum that invites readers to pay attention to the mutual interactions of what Bruno Latour designates as quasi-subjects and quasi-objects, the hybrid assemblages that include us and shape our earthbound existence. Our planetary home hosts assemblages that seem both familiar and alien. They strike us as ironic or even uncanny because we have repressed the awareness of how nothing truly separates the categories of human and other than human. The resulting nature cultures, this is Donna Haraway's term, are marvelous as well as threatening. Finding words to describe both the dangers and wonders of that newly recognized state of affairs is an essential step toward inhabiting the planet in a more responsible way. Thank you.